Who let the janitor into the boardroom? That's what the regional sales director said out loud, in front of 11 people, when a black man in a gray hoodie walked through the glass doors of Meridian Financial Group's 32nd floor conference room, carrying nothing but a paper coffee cup and a worn leather notebook. The man didn't stop walking. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, sat down, set his coffee on the coaster in front of him, and opened the notebook to a clean page. The director, whose name was Brett Calloway, laughed. Not a quiet laugh. The kind of laugh that needed an audience. "Sir, I think you may have the wrong room. This is a private meeting." The man looked up from his notebook. "I know." Calloway turned to the woman beside him, Andrea Sims, his assistant, with a look that said, "Handle this." She stood up, smoothing her blazer. "Can I help you find where you're supposed to be?" "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," the man said. He picked up his coffee and took a slow sip. "Let's give it another 4 minutes. We're waiting on 2 more from the Vancouver office." Calloway's smile didn't drop. It just got tighter. He had no idea the next 4 minutes would be the last 4 minutes of his career, as he knew it. 6:40 in the morning. Downtown Toronto. The kind of November that gets inside your coat before you've made it half a block from the subway exit. The CN Tower was barely visible through low cloud. Sleet tapped against office windows. The streets were quiet, except for the sound of salt trucks grinding through intersections and the occasional courier bike rattling over a grate. On the 32nd floor of the Meridian Financial Tower, the lights had been on since 5. Someone had ordered pastries that nobody was eating. A row of name placards sat on the long glass table. Presentation slides glowed on the wall screen. The agenda said, Q4 Regional Performance Review, National Leadership Summit. What the agenda did not say, because almost nobody in that building knew it yet, was that this particular review had been flagged by the Meridian Board 3 months earlier. Flagged because the Toronto Central region, under Brett Calloway's leadership, had posted the worst client retention numbers in the company's Canadian division for 2 consecutive quarters. Flagged because 3 internal complaints had been filed by junior analysts in the past 18 months, all describing the same pattern. Intimidation. Credit theft. A director who took the wins and distributed the losses. Every complaint had gone to HR. Every complaint had been closed without escalation. That was the reason a man named Owen Ibarra had taken the 6:15 train from Montreal. Owen Ibarra was 43 years old. He had a finance degree from McGill, an MBA from the Rotman School of Management, and 11 years at Meridian, the last 4 of which he had spent as the company's national director of performance oversight. His job, in plain language, was to go to the places that were underperforming and find out why. Not by reading reports, by showing up. He had learned early in his career that reports told you what people wanted you to know. Showing up told you everything else. He dressed the way he always dressed on these visits. No tie, no briefcase, no company lanyard visible. A gray hoodie, dark jeans, clean boots. He looked like someone's older brother who'd wandered in from the parking garage. He looked, deliberately, like nobody important. He had read the Toronto file on the train. Twice, every complaint, every quarter, every name. He bought a coffee from the cart on the ground floor, took the elevator to 32, and walked into the room like he owned the floor, because in every way that mattered, he did. The 2 people from the Vancouver office arrived at 6:58. Owen watched Calloway greet them with handshakes and the easy confidence of a man who had never once worried about his standing in a room. Calloway was tall, broad, with the kind of posture that came from years of being the tallest person at every table. He wore a suit that cost more than most of the junior analysts in his division made in a month. He had been at Meridian for 9 years. He had made regional director at 37. He had also, over those 9 years, developed an absolute certainty that he could read a room the moment he entered it. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who needed managing? Who could be ignored? He had read Owen wrong. He'd done it in front of 11 witnesses, which would matter later. Owen had not introduced himself. He had simply sat down and waited. He did this on purpose. He wanted to see what happened in the space before the meeting started, when people thought nobody important was watching. The way people fill that space says everything. Calloway spent it leaning against the wall near the window, telling a story about a client golf weekend in Muskoka that nobody had asked to hear. 2 of the junior analysts laughed on cue. One of them, a young woman named Petra Wolf, kept her eyes on her laptop and did not laugh. At 7:01, one of the Vancouver directors, a quiet man named Rashid Oma, sat down across the table from Owen and extended his hand. Rashid Oma, Vancouver West. Owen Abara. Rashid paused for just a beat. Then his eyebrows moved, almost imperceptibly. He had heard the name. "Good to meet you," Rashid said carefully. Owen nodded and looked back at his notebook. Calloway finally sat down at 7:03, at the chair to Owen's left. The chair that most people in the room assumed was the head of the table, because Calloway had placed his name card there himself. First thing that morning, he looked at the name card in front of Owen, which said nothing, because Owen hadn't brought one. "So," Calloway said, with the smile of a man who had decided to be generous, "are we getting started? Or are we still waiting on someone?" He glanced at Owen the way you glance at a piece of furniture you're considering moving. "We can start," Owen said. Calloway looked around the table, as if expecting someone to explain who this man was and why he was answering questions. Nobody said anything. Calloway's jaw shifted slightly. He picked up his remote, clicked to the first slide. "Right. So, Q4 performance overview, Toronto Central Region." "We'll get to the regional breakdowns," Owen said. He didn't raise his voice. "I want to start with the complaint files." The room went still. Not the polite, transitional stillness of a meeting changing gears. The held-breath stillness of people who know something has just changed, but don't yet understand what or how badly. Calloway set the remote down on the table. "I'm sorry?" His voice was level, but his eyes had sharpened. "And you are?" Owen opened his notebook. He wrote the time at the top of the page. 7:05. "I'll introduce myself properly in a moment," he said. "First, I'd like someone to explain to me how 3 formal internal complaints were closed without escalation in an 18-month window. All 3 from the same reporting structure. All 3 citing the same supervisor." He looked up. "That's a process question. Anyone can answer it." Silence. Calloway's face had changed. The smile was still there, but it had gone rigid, the way ice looks right before it cracks. "I think," he said slowly, "that whoever organized this meeting may have made an error. These are confidential HR matters, and I'm not sure who authorized A." He paused, looking Owen over, letting the pause do work he didn't want to do himself. "A third-party consultant, was it? To have access to internal." "I'm not a consultant." "Then perhaps you could tell us exactly who you are and what your role is here, because right now I'm not sure you should be sitting at this table." Owen looked at him for a moment. The look wasn't angry. It wasn't surprised. It was patient in a way that made the patience itself feel like a verdict. He reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and placed a small card on the table, slid it across the glass toward Calloway. Calloway picked it up. "Read it." His eyes moved across the card once, then again slower. He set it back down, carefully. The card said, "Owen Abara, National Director, Performance Oversight, Meridian Financial Group, Canada." Below that, in smaller text, "Office of the Chief Executive." Calloway didn't say anything for 3 full seconds. The room watched him not say anything. "Right," he said finally. "Of course. I didn't recognize." He stopped. Tried again. "We weren't notified that anyone from National would be attending today." "No," Owen said, "you weren't." He looked down at his notebook and continued writing. The next 90 minutes were the longest of Brett Calloway's professional life. Owen didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. He had the complaint files, printed and tabbed, which he placed in front of each person at the table. He had the retention numbers cross-referenced against individual analyst performance, which showed clearly that 3 of the team's top performers had left the Toronto Central Division in 14 months, all citing management climate in their exit interviews. He had the exit interviews. Calloway had never seen the exit interviews. He had not known they existed in the form Owen was holding, because the HR director who had processed them, a man named Stuart Graves, had marked them for regional review only, which meant they went to Calloway's desk and stopped there. Stuart Graves was also in the room. He had not eaten a single pastry. When Owen turned to the complaint files specifically, he did not editorialize. He read sections aloud in a flat, even voice. What was described, when it was reported, what action was taken, what action the Meridian Employee Handbook said should have been taken. The gap between those two things was not subtle. Petra Wolf, the young analyst who had not laughed at the Muskoka story, sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes fixed on Owen. At one point, when Owen read a passage from the second complaint that described a junior analyst being publicly blamed for a client loss that the file clearly showed had been caused by a decision made above her, Petra's jaw tightened. The muscles in her neck went visible. Owen noticed. He kept reading. Calloway tried, twice, to redirect the conversation. The first time, he suggested that the exit interview data was being presented without full context. Owen asked him to provide the context. He didn't have it. The second time, Calloway suggested that the complaint process had followed standard procedure as outlined to him by HR. Owen turned to Stuart Graves. Graves looked at the table. "Stuart," Owen said, "can you walk us through the standard escalation procedure for repeat complaints against the same individual?" Graves cleared his throat. "The standard procedure is escalation to the regional VP after a second complaint from the same reporting structure. And in this case?" Another long pause. "It was not escalated." "Why not?" Graves picked up his water glass, set it back down. "I deferred to regional leadership's assessment." "Regional leadership," Owen said, "meaning the director named in the complaints." Graves did not answer. Owen wrote something in his notebook. He did not explain what he was writing. That was, he had found over the years, often more effective than saying anything at all. The meeting ended at 8:50. Owen asked everyone except Calloway and Graves to step out. He thanked the Vancouver team, thanked Rashid Uma specifically for the corrected Q3 cross-border data. Rashid had quietly emailed him at 7:45 and watched the room empty. When the glass door closed, Owen looked at Calloway. Calloway had spent the last 90 minutes doing the math. He was a smart man. He had gotten where he was, partly by being a smart man. He had run the numbers before the meeting was over, and he knew what they added up to. "I want to say," Calloway began, "that I understand how this looks. I understand the optics. But I've dedicated 9 years to this company, and I think given the full picture." "Brett," Owen said his first name, once, quietly, the way you say a word to close a door. Calloway stopped. "When I came into this room this morning," Owen said, "you asked who let the janitor into the boardroom. He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. In front of 11 people." Calloway opened his mouth. "Don't," Owen said. "Whatever you're about to say, don't." He looked out the window for a moment. 32 floors down, Toronto was waking up. Taxis, umbrellas, a GO train crossing the elevated tracks. The city doing what it always did, indifferent to anything happening above it. "I've spent the last 4 months reading about this office," Owen said. "3 talented people quit because they didn't feel safe here. A 4th filed a complaint and watched it disappear. You have been operating this division as if accountability is something that applies to everyone except you." He turned back. "That ends today." He wrote something on a page, tore it cleanly from the notebook, and pushed it across the table. It was a date, 3 weeks from that morning. "You'll receive formal correspondence before end of business today," Owen said. "You'll have the option to review the findings with legal counsel. The date on that page is your hearing with the board's governance committee." He closed the notebook. "I'd encourage you to come prepared." Calloway looked at the paper. His hand, when he reached for it, was not steady. "Stewart," Owen said, turning to Graves, who had been sitting so still he might have been holding his breath the entire time, "you'll receive separate correspondence. Your situation is being reviewed by the ethics committee, not the governance committee. That's a distinction that matters." Graves nodded. He was a man who had made a long series of small, convenient choices, and he was now sitting in the room where all of them had caught up to him at once. Owen stood up. He picked up his notebook, his coffee cup, now empty and cold, and walked toward the door. Calloway's voice came from behind him, quieter now. The bluster had gone out of it entirely. "If I had known who you were," he said, "this morning, when you came in, I never would have." Owen stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He let the words sit in the air, let Calloway hear them for a moment in the silence. Then he turned. "That's the problem, Brett," he said. "You would have been respectful if you'd known I had the authority to review your file. But you had no idea who I was. Which means what you did this morning was exactly who you are." He held the door handle. "That's what I'll be reporting." He walked out. The glass door clicked shut behind him. The formal process moved quickly, the way these things do when the evidence is complete and the documentation is clean. Owen filed his report that evening from the Hotel Business Center. 11 pages. Everything time-stamped, everything cross-referenced. He attached the complaint files, the exit interview data, the recording. Because yes, he had been recording since the moment he sat down, as he was authorized to do under the company's oversight charter, a document Calloway had apparently never read. He sent it to 3 people, the CEO, the chair of the board's governance committee, and Meridian's general counsel. He was back in Montreal by 9 the next morning. The governance hearing took place 3 weeks later, as scheduled. Calloway came with a lawyer. The lawyer was good. The evidence was better. Calloway was terminated for cause: breach of the company's harassment and non-retaliation policies, failure of supervisory duty, conduct unbecoming of a regional director. Stuart Graves was placed on administrative leave pending a full ethics review. He resigned before the review concluded. HR's regional complaint handling process was restructured from the ground up. An independent oversight panel was established, reporting directly to the board, with no chain of command running through regional leadership. The new procedure was written into the company's national policy framework. It applied to every office in Canada. 2 of the 3 analysts who had left the Toronto Central Division were contacted by Meridian's talent team within the month. Both were offered positions. One came back. The third, a man named whose name was in Owen's original file, a junior analyst named Declan Sharp, was harder to find. He had left Meridian 14 months earlier, after his complaint was closed without action. He had spent those 14 months doing contract work, billing by the hour, taking what came, building something smaller than what he'd had. His exit interview had described the toll with the kind of careful, exhausted language that people use when they've given up expecting to be heard. Owen called him personally. A Wednesday afternoon in December, cold and clear outside his Montreal window. He explained what had happened, what the findings were, what the board had decided. He told Declan that Meridian was offering a formal, written apology from the CEO and a director-level position in the newly restructured Toronto division, reporting directly to the incoming regional head. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why are you telling me this yourself?" Declan asked. "Because someone should have called you 14 months ago," Owen said. "And they didn't. So I'm calling now." Another pause. "Then, can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need," Owen said. He called back 4 days later and said yes. Petra Wolf had submitted her statement to Owen's team the morning after the meeting. 6 pages, everything she had witnessed over 18 months, filed under her own name. No anonymity requested. She said later that she had been waiting for someone to make it safe to tell the truth. She hadn't known if that moment would ever come. When it did, she didn't want to waste it. She was promoted to senior analyst 7 months after the restructuring. She was the one who helped orient Declan Sharp when he came back to the Toronto office in February. She showed him around the floor like it was a place he had every right to be, because it was. Rashid Uma, the Vancouver director, who had extended his hand across the table at 7 in the morning and said nothing more than necessary, sent Owen a short email 2 weeks after the hearing. It said, "Results like this don't happen by accident. Good work." Owen printed it, folded it in half, and put it in the bottom drawer of his desk. He wasn't entirely sure why. He just felt like it should be kept somewhere. Owen Ibarra returned to Montreal and went back to work. The stack on his desk was always the same. New files, new offices, new sets of names and numbers and patterns that someone hoped would stay buried. He read each one the way he always did, carefully. Then he bought a train ticket, packed a gray hoodie, and showed up. He had been doing this for 4 years, and he expected to be doing it for 4 more, at least. The work was not glamorous. It was not fast. Most of the time, the people on the wrong end of his reports didn't even understand what they had done wrong. Not really. Not until they were sitting in a room with the evidence in front of them, and nowhere left to redirect. But every so often, the right file landed on his desk at the right time, and a door opened somewhere for someone who had stopped expecting it to. That was enough to keep going. On the corner of his desk, between his monitor and the window that looked out over the St. Lawrence, he had placed a single photograph. It was from Declan Sharp's first week back at the Toronto office. Someone had taken it informally, probably on a phone. Declan was standing at a whiteboard, marker in hand, mid-sentence, explaining something to a room of people who were leaning forward to listen. He wasn't smiling in the photograph. He didn't need to. Owen picked up the next file and started reading. So here's the question, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Before you answer, when Owen Ibarra walked into that boardroom in a gray hoodie and said nothing about who he was, he made a choice. He could have introduced himself in the first 60 seconds and shut the whole thing down before it started. He could have ended it the moment Calloway said what he said. He didn't. He waited. He watched. He let the room show him exactly what it was when it believed nobody important was watching. If you were in his position, what would you have done? Would you have revealed yourself immediately and stopped it in its tracks? Or would you have stayed quiet, taken the notes, and let the evidence build itself? Drop your answer in the comments. There's no wrong answer here, and the ones that make people think hardest are usually the most honest ones. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you angry, or relieved, or reminded you of something you've seen or lived through. That's the whole point. The next story is even harder to believe. I keep thinking about the moment. Owen picked up his coffee cup and just waited. He didn't correct Calloway. He didn't flash his credentials. He sat at the head of a table where nobody thought he belonged, and he let the room do what rooms do when they think no one important is watching. He let it reveal itself completely. That's not passivity. That takes a particular kind of intelligence. The kind that understands you learn more from listening than from speaking, more from watching than from announcing yourself. Owen had spent 11 years building that kind of mind. He walked into that boardroom knowing exactly what he was looking for, and he was patient enough to let it come to him. There's something in that worth sitting with. Most of us, if we're honest, would have corrected the assumption in the first 30 seconds. We'd have shut it down fast, and we'd have felt justified doing it. Owen chose differently. He chose to know more instead of win sooner. And then there's Petra. She's the one who stayed in my head longest, actually. She didn't laugh at the Muskoka story. She kept her eyes on her laptop and her mouth shut, and for 18 months she watched and waited and said nothing. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't yet believe that telling the truth would cost less than staying quiet. The morning Owen walked in, something shifted. She felt the room change, and when it did, she didn't hesitate. 6 pages. Her full name, no anonymity requested. That's a specific kind of courage. Not the loud kind, the kind that waits until the door is open and then walks through it completely. What I find myself returning to is the idea that everything in that story followed logically from what people actually were. Calloway wasn't undone by bad luck or a technicality. He was undone by years of operating as though the rules didn't include him, as though his authority was a personal possession rather than something held in trust. The complaints didn't disappear. They accumulated. The exit interviews didn't vanish. They sat in a drawer until someone arrived who knew where to look. The story of that office had been telling itself the whole time. It just needed someone willing to read it. Declan Sharp spent 14 months rebuilding something smaller than what he'd had, doing contract work, billing by the hour, because he told the truth and the institution chose convenience over him. That's a real cost. That's not a small thing. And when the call finally came, the reinstatement, the back pay, the apology, he sat on a car bumper in an auto shop and cried. Not because the system worked, because it had failed him for so long, and the relief of being seen was almost too much to hold. I think about what it takes to keep going when the institution around you has decided you're not worth the trouble. That's not a question of credentials or skill. It's a question of something harder to name. A refusal to let what happened to you become the final version of your story. Owen Ibarra went back to Montreal and opened the next file. That's the whole thing, right there.